That's about how much the US government spends every year on like basic goods and services.
Wow,
It's a lot, right?
that's a lot of money.
So, makes you really think about how that whole massive system works. And, one thing that we should probably pay more attention to is this concept called contract bundling.
Yeah, especially if you're, someone who keeps up with like government stuff and, legislation and all that.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, in this deep dive, we're going to like really get into all the complexities surrounding contract bundling in the federal government, and we'll be using a bunch of GAO reports and an executive order to like guide us through it.
Okay, so for anyone who maybe hasn't heard of contract bundling, can you just like quickly explain what it is?
Sure. So basically, contract bundling is when you take like two or more smaller procurement needs, like things the government needs to buy, and you combine them into one big contract.
Okay, so like instead of having a bunch of little contracts, they're all rolled into one giant one.
Yeah. And at first glance, that might seem like a good idea, right?
Yeah.
Consolidate everything, make it more efficient.
Right, less paperwork.
Exactly. But here's the thing. These huge contracts, they often end up being like way too big for smaller businesses to handle.
Right, they probably don't have the staff or the resources to take on something that massive.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you end up with this situation where the government's trying to be efficient, but they might actually be shutting out smaller businesses from getting a piece of the pie.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, what we're trying to figure out in this deep dive is how good is the government at actually tracking and managing all this contract bundling? And, like, what does it mean for small businesses trying to get government contracts?
Right. And you would think that would be pretty easy to figure out, just look at
Yeah.
the numbers. But it's actually a lot harder than it seems to get like a clear picture of what's really going on.
Interesting. Okay, so let's start with, like, why the government is so keen on consolidating all these contracts. I mean, what's the big argument for doing it this way?
Well, the main idea behind all this contract consolidation, and remember, bundling is just one type of consolidation. The main idea is to make things more efficient.
Makes sense. I mean, the government's always trying to be more efficient, right?
Exactly. And that's really what this executive order is all about. It's specifically trying to cut down on waste and duplication by centralizing all the procurement for like everyday stuff through the GSA.
The General Services Administration.
Right, the GSA.
Okay, and I think we even saw a quote from someone at the GSA, Tiffany Hickson.
Yeah, I remember that.
She was talking about like huge efficiencies and benefits from consolidating all these schedule contracts.
Yeah, she was definitely optimistic about it.
So what are some of the like specific benefits they're hoping to get out of this whole consolidation thing?
Well, first of all, they want to streamline the whole procurement process. Make it simpler and faster, less paperwork, fewer contracts.
Right, less bureaucracy.
Exactly. And that also means lower administrative costs because they're managing fewer contracts overall. And ultimately, the goal is to free up other agencies to focus on their core missions, the stuff they're supposed to be doing, instead of getting bogged down in all the details of buying, office supplies and that kind of thing.
Okay, so it sounds good in theory, but you mentioned earlier that it's actually pretty tough to get a clear picture of what's going on with contract bundling.
Yeah, that's right.
So where do things start to get messy?
Well, one of the biggest problems is that the data on contract bundling is actually really unreliable. And this is something that comes up again and again in the GAO reports.
So like the numbers aren't adding up?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
The Federal Procurement Data System, the FPDS, that's supposed to be the main source of information on all federal contracting. But the GAO found that there were some pretty big discrepancies between what agencies were reporting as bundled contracts and what was actually showing up as bundled in the FPDS.
So like agencies were saying one thing, but the system was saying something totally different.
Exactly. It was like they were talking about two completely different things.
Wow. And how big were these discrepancies? Like, were we talking about a few contracts here and there, or was it something more serious?
Oh, it's definitely more than just a few contracts. To give you an idea, back in fiscal year 2002, agencies reported 24 bundled contracts to the Office of Federal Procurement Policy.
Okay. 24.
Right. But get this, the FPDS for the same year showed 928 contracts as bundled.
Whoa. That's a huge difference.
Yes, it's a massive gap, and it really highlights the problem here.
So what was going on? Why was there such a big mismatch between the reports and the actual data?
Well, according to agency officials, there were a few reasons. One of the biggest issues was that a lot of people just didn't really understand what contract bundling was. They were confused about the actual legal definition of it.
So like they didn't know what they were looking for.
Exactly. They didn't always know if a particular contract actually qualified as bundling or not.
Okay, so some of it was like a misunderstanding of the rules.
Right. And on top of that, there wasn't enough verification of the data that was going into the FPDS. Nobody was double-checking to make sure it was accurate. And the system itself didn't have any good controls to prevent or detect errors.
So it was kind of a perfect storm of human error and, like, system problems.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And all of that led to some really weird results. For example, a good chunk of the contracts that the FPDS labeled as bundled were actually awarded to small businesses.
Wait, so the system that's supposed to be tracking contracts that are bad for small businesses was accidentally labeling contracts that were good for them as bad?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty messed up.
Yeah, it definitely highlights how flawed the data was.
So how can we be sure that the data is accurate?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something that the GAO really hammered home in their reports. They kept saying that the government needs to make sure that the data on contract bundling is reliable and consistent across all agencies.
Okay, so that's like step one, fix the data.
Exactly. We can't even start to understand the problem if we're working with bad information.
Right. Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. And then on top of that, the GAO also said that we need better metrics to actually measure the impact of contract bundling, especially on small businesses.
Okay, so what do you mean by metrics? Like, what kind of things are we talking about?
So right now, agencies are tracking things like the overall percentage of procurement dollars that go to small businesses, and they're reviewing the justifications for bundling.
Right, so we know how much money is going to small businesses overall.
Right. But what we don't have is a way to track specifically how much bundling is happening and how it's directly affecting small businesses' chances of getting contracts.
So, like, we can see the big picture, but we can't zoom in and see the details.
Exactly. And that was a major concern for the GAO. They said that without these specific metrics, it's really hard to know if the efforts to reduce unnecessary bundling are actually working.
Right, because we don't know what impact the bundling itself is having.
Exactly. And we also don't know how effective the strategies to mitigate the negative effects of bundling are if we don't have a way to measure those effects.
So it's kind of like shooting in the dark.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
We need better tools to understand what's really going on and to make sure that the policies we're putting in place are actually having the intended effect.
So what are the potential downsides of contract bundling for small businesses? Why should we even care about this?
Well, one of the biggest problems is that contract bundling can make it much harder for small businesses to compete for those big government contracts.
Because they're just too big.
Exactly. A lot of small businesses just don't have the financial resources or the infrastructure to handle a huge project like that. They might not have enough employees or the right equipment, or they might not be able to get the necessary bonding.
So basically, they're automatically at a disadvantage.
Yeah, pretty much. And it puts them in a tough spot because the whole point of contract bundling is to create these really big contracts that are specifically designed to be too much for a small business to handle on their own.
So it's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah, in a way. And
Yeah.
because of that, small businesses often end up having to take on subcontracting roles, which usually means they have less control over the project and they make less money.
Right, so they're not really calling the shots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can also make it harder for small businesses to team up with each other or form joint ventures to go after those larger contracts.
So it's really changing the whole landscape of how small businesses can compete for government work?
That's right. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So are there any rules in place to prevent the government from just bundling everything and shutting out small businesses completely?
Yeah, there are some safeguards.
Hmm.
The Small Business Reauthorization Act says that agencies should avoid bundling whenever possible, unless they can show that there are clear and substantial benefits to doing it.
Okay, so there has to be a good reason for bundling.
Right. And there are also specific requirements for justifying bundling, especially for what they call substantial bundling, which is when the contracts go over a certain dollar amount. Agencies have to explain why they need to bundle and what steps they're taking to make sure that small businesses can still participate, even if it's just as subcontractors.
So it sounds like the rules are there, but without good data and good metrics, it's hard to tell if they're actually being followed.
Exactly. That's the crux of the issue.
So let's go back to the GAO's recommendations. What did they say needs to happen to improve oversight of contract bundling?
Well, their main recommendations focused on two key areas: improving data accuracy and establishing better metrics.
Okay, so those were the biggies.
Yeah, and for the data accuracy part, they said that agencies need to make sure they're reporting consistent and reliable information on contract bundling to the FPDS.
So get everyone on the same page and make sure the numbers are right.
Exactly. And they also stressed that any planned upgrades to the FPDS need to prioritize accurate reporting of bundling data.
So no more garbage in, garbage out.
Right. They made it very clear that reliable data is absolutely crucial for holding agencies accountable for their bundling practices and for making sure that Congress and the president can properly oversee the whole process. And the good news is that the OMB agreed with this recommendation.
Okay, so everyone's on board with fixing the data. What about the metrics part? What did the GAO say about that?
Well, their second recommendation was that the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, the OFPP, should create specific metrics for contract bundling. And these metrics should be designed to measure both how much bundling is happening and how it's affecting small businesses' opportunities to get contracts.
So, like a way to quantify the problem and track its impact?
Exactly. And the GAO argued that without these metrics, we're basically just guessing about the real effects of bundling.
So, just having accurate data isn't enough. We need a way to actually analyze it and figure out what it means.
That's right. We need the tools to interpret the data and draw meaningful conclusions.
So, what did the OMB think about that recommendation?
Well, while they agreed that the data needs to be more reliable, they weren't initially on board with creating new government-wide reporting requirements for these specific metrics. They were worried about creating extra paperwork and putting too much of a burden on agencies.
So, they were concerned about adding more bureaucracy.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
But the GAO pushed back hard on that. They said that these metrics are essential for really understanding how bundling affects small businesses. They argued that just having better data isn't enough. We need a way to use that data to measure the actual impact.
So, it was a bit of a standoff.
Yeah, it really highlights the ongoing debate about the best way to balance the need for transparency and accountability with the desire to avoid unnecessary red tape.
So, did the GAO have any other recommendations?
Yeah, their third recommendation was that the Small Business Administration, the SBA, should move faster in sharing best practices for maximizing small business contract opportunities. This was something that the OFPP strategy had already called for, but the GAO wanted to see more urgency.
So, they wanted the SBA to step up and help small businesses get a bigger piece of the pie.
Exactly. The idea is that agencies should incorporate these best practices into their training programs and other materials so that contracting officers are more aware of how to support small businesses.
Okay. So, that's a pretty practical suggestion.
Yeah, and the SBA agreed with it.
So, it seems like there's some common ground, but also some areas where there's still disagreement.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
The GAO report also talked about the difficulty of figuring out the specific effects of regulations that are supposed to help small businesses. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So when new regulations are put in place with the goal of increasing opportunities for small businesses, it's really hard to isolate the impact of those specific regulations from everything else that's happening at the same time.
So, like, it's hard to tell if the changes are because of the new rules or because of other things that were already in motion.
It's exactly. For example, a lot of agencies already have their own programs and initiatives to promote small business contracting. So if we see an increase in small business awards after a new regulation is implemented, it's tough to say for sure whether that increase is because of the regulation or because of the agency's existing efforts.
It's like trying to untangle a really complicated knot.
Yeah, it's not easy. And the GAO also pointed out that since many agencies said they weren't doing much bundling in the first place, the impact of these new regulations specifically targeting bundling might actually be pretty limited. If bundling isn't as widespread as the initial data suggested, then maybe these regulations won't have a huge impact on the overall numbers.
So, it's possible that the problem isn't as big as we thought it was.
It's definitely a possibility. But even if that's the case, it's still important to have the right data and the right metrics to make sure we're monitoring the situation and making informed decisions.
Okay, so what's happening now? Are there any ongoing efforts to address all these issues we've been talking about?
Yeah, there are. As we mentioned earlier, the GSA is working on consolidating its schedule contracts with the goal of making things more efficient and streamlined for everyone.
Right, that was one of the big motivations for all this in the first place.
Exactly, and it's an ongoing process.
Mhm.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And at the same time, policymakers are trying to figure out how to balance the need for efficiency with the need to make sure that small businesses still have a fair shot at getting government contracts.
Right, because it's important to save taxpayer money, but it's also important to support small businesses.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the biggest takeaways about contract bundling?
I'd say the two biggest challenges are the inaccurate data and the lack of good metrics.
Hmm.
We've got to fix the data problem if we want to even begin to understand what's really going on.
Yeah.
And then we need to develop better ways to measure the impact of bundling, especially on small businesses.
Right, those are the foundation.
Exactly. And the GAO made some specific recommendations to address those challenges. But there's still some debate about the best way to move forward, especially when it comes to those metrics.
Yeah, OMB wasn't totally convinced about that part.
Right. So it's a conversation that's still ongoing, and it raises some important questions about how we ensure accountability in government contracting and how we balance the need for efficiency with the need to support small businesses.
And it leaves us with something to think about as we move forward. How do we create a system that's fair and efficient and that gives everyone a chance to succeed? It's a question that goes beyond just contract bundling. It's really about the fundamental values that we want to see reflected in our government.
Yeah, it's about finding that right balance between being fiscally responsible and fostering a diverse and thriving business community. And that's a conversation worth having.